So it's my great pleasure to welcome Victoria and Anna. Victoria Dickenson is a retired museum director and curator. She has a PhD in the history of science from Carleton University and has published extensively in the history of natural history, in natural and cultural histories of animals and plants, and in material culture. She is currently Professor of Practice, Rare Books and Special Collections at McGill Library and the Principal Investigator for the Gwillim Project. And she is joined this evening by Anna Winterbottom. Anna works on the history of medicine, science and environment with a focus on the early modern Indian Ocean region and the European colonial presence there. She is the author of Hybrid Knowledge in the Earlier East India Company World, 2016, and co-editor of Histories of Medicine in the Indian Ocean World, the East India Company and the Natural World, and most recently, last year, Women, Environment and Networks of Empire. She is the Research Associate for the Gwillim Project and Principal Editor for Women, Environment and Networks of Empire, which is also the title of their talk this evening. So over to you, Victoria and Anna.
Well, thank you very much, Will. And I'd like to thank the Linnean Society for inviting us to speak and to Padma for encouraging us to speak about the book. This is a double act, so I will be beginning and then Anna will be taking over and then I'll be coming back and then we'll be ending together. So I'm going to take this opportunity to present the Gwillim book. So yes, we'll move it over a bit more to me at this point. What we call the Women, Environment and Networks of Empire, Elizabeth Gwillim and Mary Symonds in Madras. This book grew out, I'm having a little trouble there. That's fine. Sorry. This book grew out of the Gwillim Project, which was a research project based in rare books and special collections at McGill Library in the McGill University in Montreal. And it began in 2019 and ended officially in 2023. But with this talk, as you can see, it continues to go on. And we continue to engage with people within the Gwillim Project network. The Gwillim Project began with collections. So the Rare Books and Special Collections at McGill has a very special collection in natural history, the Blackerwood Natural History Collection. Within it are some wonderful watercolors and paintings, and in particular, a large portfolio that was purchased in London in 1924 by Casey Wood. Wood found it in the basement of a bookshop, and when he opened it, he was amazed to find these extraordinary bird paintings by Elizabeth Gwillim, by whom he learned was Elizabeth Gwillim. So in the Blackerwood Natural History Collection are 121 watercolors of birds by Elizabeth Gwillim, and from their internal numbering, there are originally probably over 200 of these watercolors. There are also 12 flowers by Elizabeth Gwillim and 31 fish paintings by Elizabeth Gwillim, and as we learned, by Mary Symonds as well. So this was the first collection that I began to investigate at McGill. And I learned that the collection had been digitized by, thanks to the good graces of Jeffrey Spear of New York University, who was interested in Elizabeth Gwillim's correspondence. So Jeffrey, who is a member of our research network, led me to the correspondence at the British Library. So this correspondence between Elizabeth Gwillim and Mary Symonds to their mother, Esther Symonds, and sister, Hester James, as well as friends, with a letter from Henry Gwillim and some notes from Richard Clark, Sir Henry's assistant, was over 700 pages and includes drawings. And you can see there's a wonderful drawing here that Elizabeth sketches herself at her writing desk with portraits of her family around her as she writes from Madras. We're fortunate that the correspondence of Elizabeth Gwillim and Mary Symonds is now available on the Oxford Text Archive, and our thanks to the British Library and to Anna Winterbottom, who made this possible. Looking at the correspondence led me, when I was in London, to find out about another collection related to the correspondence, the Madras and Environs album. This is Mary Symonds' album. It's held in the South Asian Collection Museum in Norwich, and there are 78 watercolors. Some of them are by Elizabeth Gwillim and Mary Symonds, and one possibly by Henry Gwillim. It was acquired at auction, and you can see all 78 watercolors on the South Asian Collection Museum site. So we had these three collections, and as we began to think about what that might do, we realized that in conversations with Jeffrey and with other scholars, including Subramanya, we realized we had a project. Anna came into the project, and we started to create an application for funding, which we titled Women, Environment, and Networks of Knowledge and Exchange in Early 19th Century Madras. We were successful in getting a Social Science and Humanities Research Council Partnership Development Grant, and we brought together these partners, the Rare Books and Special Collections, the Indian Ocean World Center at McGill, with which Anna is associated, the South Asia Collection in Norwich, McGill Queens University Press, the Aga Khan Museum in Toronto, and the Center for World Environmental History at the University of Sussex. As we worked through the first year of the project, we realized we found other partners, and we were successful in getting a Shastri Indo-Canadian Foundation grant, which brought into the project IIT Madras and the Dakshina Chitra Museum in Chennai. We also got a Digital Museum of Canada grant, which allowed the partners to create a website, which we'll talk a bit more about later. So the project was now up and running, and the thing that made the project exceptional and successful was, in fact, the research network. This was an interdisciplinary international network, and it was connected online. There were over 50 scholars and researchers in Canada, India, the UK, and the US, including ornithologists, botanists, environmental historians, architectural historians, naturalists, historians of science, food historians, curators, librarians, archivists. We had literary scholars like Jeffrey, art historians, so a very rich mix of people who contributed their knowledge and their thinking to this project. We kept the network together, and I'm really happy to say that online meetings, a regular newsletter, and 2 symposia actually brought the network together, and mainly online. What did we do in the first year or 2 of the network? Well, we knew that the first year of the project, we knew we had to make the archive available. So we created a digital archive for the Gwillim Project. We obtained an Orphan Works license for the British Library materials, and we undertook transcriptions of the letters. And as you can see, some of that transcription was challenging. Our students worked on this with us. We digitized with the Norwich Museum, the Madras album, and we completed the entries in the McGill catalog, in particular adding the scientific names to the images of the birds, flowers, and fish. And finally, we shared the archive. We shared the archive on a Teams platform, and we created a website. So the project website, which is still available, and I urge you to take a look at it, it's very simple, the gwillimproject.com, hosts case studies by the research associates and our RA students and network members, transcriptions, biographies, and other resources. A really rich resource for the project, and one which allowed us to share the material across countries. We also planned on, as most these kind of research projects do, on an in-person symposium, and we planned for it in the spring of 2020. So obviously the global pandemic precluded the symposium, and so instead we turned to a relatively new networking application called Zoom. And we used Zoom to present a series of 9 webinars, which brought together our network of scholars and others to explore the Gwillim collections. The Gwillim Project Online is on YouTube. We received hundreds of views, more than we could possibly have ever received in a symposium here at McGill. And we enlarged our audience, particularly in India. So you can still look at the Gwillim Project online. We've had over 35,000 views on the project since it was inaugurated in 2020. And the Gwillim Project online really kind of began the genesis for a book project. I'm now going to turn this over to Anna, who is the driving force behind the Gwillim book.
Thanks so much, Victoria. So this was the book, and it turned out to be a very big book. So we have 21 authors altogether involved in the book. 10 chapters, 5 case studies, 65 color plates, and 25 black and white figures. So we're really grateful to McGill Queens University Press for taking us through the process of publishing this. So our approach to the book was really to read the correspondence alongside the visual evidence and see what came out from that. And the interdisciplinary nature of the network was really important in enabling us to do that. And several of the chapters are actually co-authored by people from quite different disciplines. And these co-authoring relationships grew out of discussions and presentations in the online symposium series. And I'm really grateful to all of the authors, not only for their amazing work, but for being willing to work like this in such a collaborative way. So as well as the chapters, the book contains a series of short case studies, and these focus in particular on particular artworks or particular letters, on specific themes. So one of our primary objectives in the project and in the book was to think about the lives of female naturalists. So the introduction opens with a discussion of the two sisters themselves, Mary Symonds and Elizabeth Symonds, later Elizabeth Gwillim. So I'll start as well by telling you a little bit about them. So Elizabeth and Mary were born almost a decade apart in Hereford, and they were the children of Esther and Thomas Symonds. Thomas Symonds was an architect and surveyor, and we know that Esther continued his work after his death. Elizabeth described her mother as a great architect. So the sisters were probably trained by both their parents in drawing, and we know they received instruction as well from a family friend, the landscape painter George Samuel. So in 1774, Elizabeth married Henry Gwillim and moved with him to London. Their sister and correspondent Hester James was also living in London at this time, and we know that Mary Symonds also spent time living with her married sisters. So the sisters' time in London would have given them an opportunity to enlarge their intellectual horizons. So they would have visited some of the gardens that were growing exotic plants. They would have gone to libraries and museums. And I'm showing you a picture of one of these museums. So this is the Librarian collection. And by the early 1800s, it had about 26,000 natural historical specimens, some of which had been depicted by Sarah Stone in the large catalogue of the Librarian Museum. So these were possible influences on Mary Symonds and Elizabeth Gwillim as they began to shape themselves into naturalists. And the two sisters left in 1801 for Madras, now Chennai, and they did so to accompany Henry Gwillim, Elizabeth's husband, who had been appointed to the newly created Supreme Court at Madras. So there's a short overview of their lives, and the rest of before arriving in India, the rest of the book really deals with their lives in India. So I'll give you now just a sort of brief overview of some of the chapters, and I hope that some of the authors are here with us as well. So Suryana Rayana or Subbu Subramanian opens the book with his really wonderful overview of Elizabeth as an ornithological painter and an ornithologist. So as he points out, Elizabeth actually painted and described a total of 135 species of birds. And this was the first really detailed account of birds around Madras, according to him. And as he points out, the birds that she painted tell us something about the environment of Madras, and more about that later. But 47% of them were water birds, 22 were birds of prey. And this is quite unusual for women of the period, who mostly would have painted smaller, more decorative birds. Several of the birds that Elizabeth Gwillim painted are now endangered or threatened, so her bird paintings also give us an insight into the species that would have been around at the beginning of the 19th century. Elizabeth Gwillim made most of her bird paintings from live birds. And as Serafina Masters points out in her case study, looking at Mary Symonds' paintings and correspondence allows an insight into how Gwillim was able to produce such accurate and lifelike paintings. So here, Symonds has painted two expert bird catchers who are swaddling live birds in cloth. And Symonds also described this process in her letters. She talks about how it was used to secure a raptor with a 3-foot wingspan. And she also describes, Symonds also describes one of the bird catchers as an elderly Muslim man who Gwillim employed to feed the birds and hold them while they were being painted. As Masters points out, while Gwillim relied heavily on the expertise of these men, we should be wary of framing this as a collaboration, given the power differential between Gwillim and the Indian experts she worked with. And notably, these men remain nameless in the correspondence. Also among the drawings at McGill are 31 paintings of aquatic creatures, mainly fish. And as Shaimal Lakshmanarayanan and Hanna Nikchevich have pointed out, although these are less detailed than the bird drawings, they nonetheless display considerable skill and attention to taxonomic detail. The correspondence reveals that these paintings were mostly done by Mary Symonds and that they were done in Kovalam, that's a seaside village close to Madras. Again, they can give us an insight into the marine life on the Coromandel coast in this period. And 2 of these species are now endangered, and one of them is no longer found in the region. The writing on the paper provides another intriguing clue as to the involvement of Indian experts. So discussions within the network revealed that the script is Urdu, but the language is Tamil. So this suggests a collaboration between one or more experts to label the paintings with their local names. Elizabeth Gwillim and Mary Symonds also relied on the expertise of fishermen. So in this passage, Elizabeth Gwillim is talking about how she would go down to the seashore expressly to buy different varieties of fish from local fishermen and also to ask them about local names. And the painting by Mary Symonds shows a local fishing craft being hauled up onto the shore filled with freshly caught fish. Also at McGill, there are 12 drawings of flowers attributed to Elizabeth Gwillim. As Henry Nolte points out in his chapter on the botany of Lady Gwillim, compared with the images of birds and fish attributed to the sisters, these 12 images are not only smaller in number, but much less detailed and complete. They're more like sketches. The only finished watercolour by Elizabeth Gwillim, discovered by Henry Nolte, is actually in the archives of the Linnean Society. And this is the image shown here. It depicts the plant that's named Magnolia Coco, but the missionary botanist J.P. Rottler, who is Elizabeth's mentor in botany while she was in Madras, gave it another name. He named it Gwillimia indica after Elizabeth herself. So as Henry Nolte writes, while in Madras, Gwillim took lessons from Rottler, and she also cultivated relations with a circle of East India Company botanists and surgeons and missionary botanists, which connected Madras to the Danish settlement of Tranquebar. And these included James Anderson, his daughter Anne Young, and his nephew Andrew Berry. Both Gwillim and Symonds clearly had some knowledge of botany before arriving in Madras, however. They were close friends with the Whitley and Thorburn families who ran a plant nursery in Brompton in London. And they engaged in exchanges of plants with this family. So Elizabeth Gwillim sent back 2 plants which were introduced to England for the first time through being planted in the gardens of the Brompton Nursery Garden. As both Henry Naughty and Serafina Masters highlight in the book, Elizabeth Gwillim and Mary Symonds' most important contacts for learning about plants were again local people. In 1802, Gwillim wrote home that her servants were constantly bringing me flowers and insects and pointing out things to me as we go along. And by 1803, a letter from Symonds demonstrates that this informal process had evolved into an organized enterprise for collecting plants and information about them. Describing her sister surrounded by plant materials, Symonds writes, "The seeds and plants are collected from the hills and woods by some poor country people. And she gets some of the native doctors to give her the common name, the Brahmins to tell her the Sanskrit, and the books are consulted to find out the Linnean names." And then Mary Symonds continues to note that the sisters also raised plants in their garden, drew them, and studied the languages and names of this country. So here again, the vital but only partially acknowledged role of Indian expertise in enabling the sisters' work is quite clear. And one thing that was surprising for many people in the network who are familiar with Chennai today is the abundance of water that is evident in the correspondence and paintings. For example, Gwillim wrote that the great beauty of this place is if you quit the sea, you always have a river on one hand or else a tank. So the riverine environment is shown in Mary Symonds' watercolour here, and also demonstrated in the predominance of water birds in Gwillim's ornithological images. Vinita Damodaran and Vikram Bhatt's chapter puts this environment into its historical context, as they note the environment of Madras was governed by the monsoon system, with the rains brought by the northeast monsoon filling the rivers and governing the rhythm of agriculture. They also point out that Gwillim and Symonds had arrived in a period of environmental calm after the 1780s and 90s, which saw storms and typhoons followed by droughts and famines. Despite the more settled conditions during the sisters' visit, there was a period of low rainfall between 1801 and 1803, and the correspondence points to the danger of famine at this time. As Vikram Bhatt and Vinita Damodaran also note, as the children of architects, Gwillim and Symonds provided detailed descriptions of the urban environments. So the garden houses of the British at this time were Palladian-style villas. However, as Gwillim describes in this passage, local Indian housing was better suited to the climate because it blocked out the heat. And later generations of British colonials would take this to heart, adopting bungalows inspired by local housing. One theme that provides an undercurrent to all the letters is the violent colonial politics of the period. As Arthur McGregor has shown in his chapter, Henry Gwillim came into direct conflict with the East India Company in his capacity as a Supreme Court judge. Henry's efforts to impartially exercise the law clashed with the East India Company's demands for despotic power in India. The period that Elizabeth Gwillim and Mary Symonds spent in India was a crucial one in the consolidation of British supremacy in the subcontinent. In his recent book, The Anarchy, William Dalrymple selected 1803 as the year in which the East India Company became the de facto ruler of India. So it was in this year that the company's army defeated Maratha forces and took possession of Delhi, capturing the Mughal emperor. While this event occurred at a distance from Madras, Elizabeth Gwillim and Mary Symonds did report on more local political events. And this painting here by Symonds shows the tomb of Ali Hussein, who was the designated heir of the Nawab of Okot, who were previously the rulers of the Carnatic. As Elizabeth wrote, he was likely poisoned by the East India Company, who deposed him so that they could assume power over the Carnatic. Another major shift in politics at this time was the defeat of Tipu Sultan by the East India Company's armies in 1799. And Tipu Sultan's sons were exiled to Vellore, 65 miles west of Madras. And in July 1806, they formed the focal point of an uprising that's known as the Vellore Mutiny. And that was the largest and most significant act of resistance to the East India Company before the much larger uprising of 1857. So the last few letters in the Gwillim archive provide valuable evidence for this dramatic event. I'm going to hand back to Victoria now to talk about some of the evidence that the Gwillim and Symonds archive provides for thinking about material culture.
Thank you, Anna. So beyond the descriptions of flora and fauna and landscape and the accounts of politics and society, the correspondence from Elizabeth and Mary is rich in the descriptions of the material culture of daily life. Elizabeth and Mary and Henry Gwillim had prominent social roles, and they required to be properly and fashionably dressed. It was important to them. And Tulika Gupta, Alexandra Kim, and Anwas, dress historians, all have collaborated together to write a wonderful chapter on the exchange of textiles and fabrics between Britain and India that was undertaken by the sisters. So they wrote to the sister Hetty in London with many requests for dresses, hats, bonnets, gloves and shoes, accessories, things that were difficult to find in India. But in return, they sent back to their sister and their mother beautiful shawls, which were to be sometimes used as shawls, but also cut up into men's waistcoats. And in the chapter, there's a wonderful image from a museum in Britain of one of these shawls made waistcoat. They're rare today. So there are very few left in museum collections. They also sent back colorful palampores, which are these large bedspreads, and described how they were made, and yards of fabric. They also were adept at smuggling their materials onto the East India Company ships because the duties were onerous for fabrics and textiles from India. So they would have textiles made up to look like dresses, which wouldn't be taxed, or they would sometimes cut up larger shawls into small packages so they could pass through the mail as opposed to in a large box. They ordered their muslins from England because it was actually cheaper with the factory-made muslins than it was to buy the Dhaka muslins, which you can see in this painting by Mary Symonds. In India, these fine handmade muslins were subject to huge duties, and with an effort to really depress the trade, the production of muslin in India, changing and making England the center of the muslin trade. And muslin, of course, was the fabric most desired for fashionable dress at this time, by both Indians and by Europeans. Mary depicted in great detail the dress of both Hindu and Muslim women, and Elizabeth and Mary both described it in their letters, along with the jewelry and the way in which the dresses were worn by the women. And I think this is a lovely example here on the right. As they adapted to India, they also tried to adapt their fashion to the heat. Henry Gwillim refused to wear his wig. It was too hot in court, but they still wore the style of Europe, which confused many of the Indian women watching them. So though they gave up some of the heavier clothes, they still insisted on wearing silk stockings and Limerick chicken skin gloves. And I want to thank Anne Wass for a recent email about the chicken skin. They weren't actually made of chicken skin, but these fine yellow gloves that we covered up to a lady's elbow, very fashionable. Similarly, the sisters tried to adapt their cuisine to what was available in India, but they still longed for the tastes of home. So Natalie Cook has described this process of adaptation. And at first, the sisters really were desperate for things like ham and gammon, things that could survive up to 6-month sea voyage. So preserves and pickles, mustards and vinegars. And they requested seeds for herbs, which were essential to their cookery. Herbs like parsley, which they couldn't get in India. They particularly missed strawberries, and so strawberry preserves were very, very welcome. But they learned over time to use mangoes and made their jelly out of mangoes. Mary said it was the best she'd ever had. They used kolakas for pies, and they started to appreciate curries, which were made by their Indian cooks. In her chapter, Natalie Cook talks about the development of curry as the quintessential English food, beginning really in the 17th century with recipes for currying or doing foods in the Indian way. And this taste for curry, which after the Gwillim period, but during the 19th century, became more and more the product of an industrial curry powder as opposed to the more traditional curry methods. Interestingly, the sisters also declared that the pastries and the breads from the local bakers were some of the best they'd ever had. So in terms of eating the food, they required tableware. And they required vast quantities of tableware because they would often sit down to a dinner with 50 people at a former dinner, and even breakfast might be 12 people just from the household sitting down to eat their eggs and fruit. So they when plates broke, as they did, they asked their sister to go to Mr. Wedgwood's and order their dishes. So the dishes were sent from Wedgwood. The sisters sent the patterns back. The Wedgwood kept their patterns of their chinaware on file. And both Darby and Wedgwood sent materials were packed and sent back to the sisters. And amazingly, these barrels of china arrived after these long sea voyages, as Elizabeth wrote, with not a single dish broken. But the China trade, if you will, went two ways. They received their china from England, and it came over time that the English china dominated the markets within India. But previously, there had been a lot of Chinese porcelain imported into India, particularly during the Mughal period, and it was still being imported from Malacca. So Elizabeth was also acquiring ginger jars and porcelain planters and sending those back to her mother, but also some local earthenware. She was intrigued by the earthenware of India, the big pots used at Pongal and the cookware that was used, but these beautiful black pots, polished black earthenware, were sent back as curiosities. And who knows, they may be part of a museum collection somewhere in England still today. Oops, sorry. Elizabeth and Mary both had painter's eyes. They were very observant. But Elizabeth in particular had a very open mind, and they attended many festivals and festivities. And Elizabeth left detailed descriptions in her letters to her mother and sister, particularly of things like the car festival at Mylapore, and also the dance of the Devadasi. So Geoffrey Spear, who is very interested in traditional dance, has written about Elizabeth's depiction of the Devadasis, which is very detailed, of the jewelry, the costume, the steps in the dance, the music, but also is without the kind of judgment that many later authors placed on the temple dancers, not being able to understand their role either within the temple or within the public space. She described other local festivals and customs, such as the Portuguese Catholic Church ceremonies, and really with this interest in the India, which she came to, the cultural life of India, which she came to greatly appreciated. She also learned Telugu probably from her Dubash, and she actually translated a Stela Puranam, or a temple legend, from the Telugu, probably with the help of local scholars. And she did send this back to England to her correspondent, Mary York, but unfortunately, the transcription seems to have been lost. But Geoffrey's description of her as a proto-ethnographer in her descriptions of Indian cultural life is most appropriate. Ben Cartwright has also looked at the sisters as artists, and particularly at Mary Symonds in the Madras album. When they came to India, as Anna has mentioned, they were trained. They continued to correspond with George Samuel, asking for advice, but they had issues of paper supply. Wove paper, which is used for watercolors, was very hard to get. So Mary was unfortunately forced to do many of her work on letter paper. They used Chinese brushes and inks, and they had the challenges of drawing in a hot climate where the size in the paper would start to dissolve. They also had new subjects. They drew Indian legends. And on the right, we have an illustration made by Mary for Sir William Jones' translation of Kalidasa's Sakuntala. She's basing this on a print. So she started to copy prints. She would get these European prints and then copy them. So you can see there's a classical influence here. Ben Cartwright compares their work to the European soldiers, artists, and naval artists, the professional landscape and portrait painters who came, like the Daniels. And what he sees, certainly in Mary's work, is this shift in perspective. So not just the facade of a building, but a view from the interior out, many views of interiors, these intimate portraits of women in particular. And again, where the company school artists were being requested by the British to do these trades and cast paintings of generic sort of portraits, Mary was doing individual portraits. So the sisters as artists were kind of going against the grain of the traditional British artists of the period, the male artists of the period. Mary also decided she wanted some way to convey an impression of India to her correspondents in England. How could she convey the crowding of the streets, the festivals? So she decided to make pasteboard models. She says that she came home from a festival and she made a model of the whole in pasteboard. And what she did was to do paintings, cut the paintings out, glue them onto pasteboard, then layer them. She was inspired perhaps by, as Hannah Niksevich says, by paper theaters and transparencies, which were popular at the end of the 18th century. And she layered these and sent instructions to her sister to layer these images to give this three-dimensional impression of a streetscape in India. It was the world made small. It was, Niksevich suggests that this idea of making a miniature, of making the small, allowed some control over what could be a very overwhelming experience. So a controllable model. Funny, the context for Elizabeth Mary's work have been explored in two chapters, one devoted to India and Indian natural history, the history of natural history in India by Marika Sardar and A.J. Urfi. So they looked at the history of natural history, these early exchanges between of Greek text into India and Indian text back, of herbals and medical work, into the Mughal period with the Baburnama and the great interest in animals, which were illustrated after, as well as the illustrators, the artists who work for Akbar and his son Jahangir, doing incredible portraits of animals, and particularly Mansour, the artist Mansour. This is not a portrait by Mansour of two hoopoes, but it's a similar kind of thing. It's been taken out of an album and glued into a different setting, but you can see the detail on those two wonderful hoopoes there. And as Urfi writes, the bottom hoopoe has the beak open. You can almost hear the call of the bird. So there's an interconnected history of natural history between India and Europe. And when the taste for natural history in the 18th century began, many of the Rajas like Sarafoji III hired Indian painters to paint in a more Western style, these isolated birds. And this was also the style which was used by the painters like Ram Das and Sheikh Zain-ud-Din, who painted for Lady Mary Impey in Calcutta, and those paintings were taken back to England. Finally, looking at Elizabeth and Mary in the context of the British women who went to India, They were not the only British women in India who traveled, painted, and wrote at this period. Lady Mary Impey, I've mentioned in Calcutta with her interest in birds and flowers. Henrietta Lady Clive and her daughters, who undertook an amazing tour of southern India in company with the artist Anna Tonelli, and brought back their collections to England. Maria Graham was in India, Anna Maria Jones. So within this context, there were many women of their class and character writing travels, writing correspondence books, painting landscapes, and particularly botany. What made Elizabeth certainly exceptional in this, and Mary, were their interests in painting birds and fish, an unusual subjects for women in this period. And probably the other thing that Rosemary Raza notes in this work is that Mary's very intimate portraits were quite different from many of the more generic portraits that were painted at this period. So the context, so they were in fact women of their time, but at the same time, they brought to it their own personal predilections and interests. I'm now going to turn this back to Anna. In conclusion.
Thanks, Victoria. So we concluded the book, and I'll conclude this talk by returning to the title for our project and for the book, so Women, Environment, and Networks of Empire. So as Rosemary Raza put it, Gwillim and Symonds were exceptional, but not unusual among women of the period. But we also wanted to think about them as naturalists. How did they differ from their male counterparts in terms of their work? So we concluded that, in fact, in many ways they were similar. They were embedded in Banksian networks of exchange. They relied on Linnean classification, and they were keen to seek recognition for introducing new plant species, for example. One difference that we found was that they tended to document their environment more thoroughly than their male contemporaries. So as well as the ornithological paintings, we have the scenes of landscapes and people, and we have their very extensive correspondence. So this allowed us to build up a more detailed picture of their lives and practices as naturalists. Second, what can the Sisters Archive tell us about the environment of Madras at the beginning of the 19th century? And here again, the interdisciplinary nature of the book and network, and the collaboration in particular between art historians and scientists, was key. So the identification of the birds and the fish added to our understanding of the range of species that were present in and around Madras at this time. And for the environmental historians in the network, they were able to build up a picture of the climate and environment of the region, including by demonstrating the emerging impact of colonial rule upon the natural environment. And finally, networks of empire. The sisters were ambivalent about the British presence in India, and especially the despotic rule of the East India Company. Nonetheless, the sisters' own impressions were shaped by prevailing European tropes about India, and they participated in and helped shape networks of empire, including through the exchanges of textiles and clothing, food and plants. One thing that stood out for us in the materials was how the sisters' work was shaped by the networks of knowledgeable Indians who caught birds and fish, gathered plants, and supplied the local names and uses. So this realization, which was partly prompted by the work of our student research assistants, was key in inspiring our new project, Hidden Hands in Colonial Natural Histories. And I'll just very briefly talk about that. So in the Gwillim Project, we used one archive to pose many different kinds of questions. So in Hidden Hands, we posed the same question to several different materials. Our key question here is how to recover the hidden hands and lost voices behind natural history collections. So we're working with libraries and archives to think about how to relabel, redisplay, and recatalogue materials, and how to recognize different forms of natural knowledge. In this project, we have 4 different case studies focusing on India, Sri Lanka, Canada, and Haiti. and materials ranging from paintings to herbarium specimens and museum collections. So in this way, we're continuing and I think extending our work that began with the Gwillim Project. So I'll end there just with thanks to everyone who made the Gwillim Project possible. So everyone at McGill, our partners at Sussex, at the South Asia Collection, in IIT Madras, and at Dickenson, and again to McGill Queens University Press. And finally, to all of our student research assistants who are so important in the project. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was absolutely wonderful. Gosh, what a treat. Just the most incredible sort of diversity, really, not just in the two women's own work, but in the responses to it that you've been able to garner through the project. I know I've got tons of questions, but I can't really abuse my position as chair to go first. So I think we'll go straight into the Q&A and see what people are posing. Christopher asks, can you say more about how the research network was established, how it grew, and what advice you might give to anyone setting up a similar network?
Well, it grew, it began with conversation. And it was I discovered Jeffrey Spear's name in the archives at McGill because he'd been responsible for funding the original digitization. I then, in researching the Gwillim, Elizabeth Gwillim discovered Subbu Subramania's early articles. He had visited McGill in the 1990s and written an article on it. From Subbu and Jeffrey, so Jeffrey in New York, Subbu in Bangalore, we started to reach out to other people. We came then to Ben Cartwright in Norwich. Anna brought some of her network into the project. It grew, in a sense, through personal conversation and personal connection. And then as we started with the webinars in 2020, people asked to join the project. And we also were able to engage with our partners at that point to seek additional people, so to bring them into the network. So for example, every webinar had someone who introduced the webinar and someone who responded. So it wasn't just the immediate members of the network, but this larger network that grew around it. For example, Natalie Cook, Akash Muralidharan, I'm sorry if I've mangled Akash's last name, but Akash, for example, responded to Natalie Cook's presentation by talking about the current the lost vegetables of India, something which he'd been working on, has a website on, so, and which were mentioned in the Gwillim letter. So the network kind of grew organically, but at the same time, we did go and seek out people who we felt would add to the network. We definitely wanted an ichthyologist, and we were fortunate that Subbu was able to introduce us to Shaimal, who introduced us to other ichthyologists, at the research center in India. So it was this branching out as we worked. And I think what is exciting for me as a historian of science is the branching out both into the scientific community, but also into the literary scholars through Jeffrey and Natalie Cook, and to the historians and to the dress and art historians, which has been a wonderful collaboration. So yeah, a bit of research, a lot of conversation, and my other advice is to be in communication. Our monthly newsletter really helped, and as did we would send postings out. We kept a group mailings, and we would send out group mailings, both of the newsletter, but also just interesting tidbits, books that might have come up, as well as the keeping up the website and people contributing to the website. You could always go back to it. Do you have anything to add, Anna?
I think one thing that the pandemic taught us was that you don't need to just bring people together for an academic conference. We can do things online altogether, but also locally. So a lot of the things that happened in the end that were most exciting were some of the local events. So for example, at Dickenson, there were some events for children, like bird walks and I think a painting competition. And those things probably wouldn't have happened if we'd run it in a more sort of conventional academic way. So those were some of the most exciting things for me, I think.
Yeah. And I think I just add a note about the students as well, because we also had young people working in Chennai. So at Dakshinachitra, Rekha Vijaya Shankar did a project, a rephotography project, using Mary Symonds images, and then showing, in fact, so using her images, then taking photographs of the places that she had depicted and how they were today. So we had this constant kind of working together, and it was a completely digital project, I have to say. We have only recently met some of the project in, as they say, IRL, in real life.
Two people have exactly the same question. I think this must have been a typo on a slide. Did Elizabeth really marry at the age of 11? I thought she was...
No. She was 21. I'm sorry, that was a typo.
Nice.
I think it should have been 1784 instead of 1774.
I think a digit on astray there. So that's nice and easy to sort out. But on a related note, Gina asks, do we know if Mary Symonds maintained any links with those in India after she'd gotten married and come back?
She married a ship's captain. So she married the ship's captain on the return voyage. And so he went out to sea again after their marriage. And so we know that through him she would have maintained those links, but unfortunately we know very little about her later life.
Unfortunately, there, as there are for many women whose works are never published and that were kept in the family, there's, unless the correspondence is preserved, thankfully it was, from their time in India, it's very difficult to find information about them. We have very bare bones biographies for both sisters.
Lots of fulsome praise for the book and for the project and the talk. Some people asking about next steps, I suppose you would say. So Carolina asks, or Carolina, beg your pardon, thanks for an amazing talk. How can this research contribute to biodiversity conservation?
Well, one of the things we did, and I think that's really important, is the involvement of ornithologists and other scientists to name, to ensure that the species that are depicted by Elizabeth Gwillim and Mary Symonds are named in, given a taxonomic name, a Latin name. And this is helpful because if you actually are researching online, you want to be able to find, if you're a biologist researching, you're going to be researching by the generic or the species name. And so this means this information will come up as you research. And this allows people to think about distribution. Anna mentioned that some of the changing environment around Chennai means that the water is less and water. So there has been restoration of wetlands around Chennai and bringing back some of these water birds. But we hope that we have made the Gwillim materials part of the legacy literature of natural history, which I think is very important when we're looking at these sort of shorter term evolution, but longer term environmental changes on distribution. So we're hoping as well that the work done by our partners on, particularly in Chennai, both at Dakshinachitra, but also at IIT Madras, have inspired younger people as well to get involved and interested in this history of the natural environment and to start thinking about the natural environment. That may not quite answer all the question, but we do see this as part of that legacy literature of natural history.
Thank you. I'm going to pull two questions together, I think, because they both concern the women's engagement with local people. So Nushat asks, were any of the local people, doctors, servants, fishermen, named in any way? And do you think their position as white women gave them certain access to knowledge or resource that their white male counterparts might not have had? And then Ramita asks, I second Nushat's question, did the sisters record their collaborations with local collectors? Who collected specimens for them? Did they correspond with the Botanical Gardens at Calcutta, the Asiatic Society, the Indian Museum, etc., etc.? So two sort of related topics there.
I was thinking, maybe I'll start with Papa and you can talk about the Asiatic Society stuff.
Okay.
Yeah. So there are very few names. There are two of the servants are named. correct me if I'm wrong, Anna, but I can remember two, Sammy, who was the Dubash, and Papa, who was Elizabeth Gwillim's serving woman. And the story of Papa is interesting because Elizabeth Gwillim actually records her history. So she asks Papa about her life, and Papa tells her she's a lower caste woman. She's been married or taken into relationships twice. She has a son, Sila. And so Elizabeth records this history of her, and Mary paints a picture of a serving woman who we think is Papa. So that's, it's, again, Anna spoke about these power relationships. Papa sleeps on the floor outside Elizabeth Gwillim's bedroom. And as Elizabeth says, she rises up at night when Sir Henry calls for toast, and serves him. But there is some sense of hearing that story, getting entree into that voice from that particular serving woman, which is a rarer kind of thing. In terms of just access that women had, both Mary and Elizabeth record visits to the Zanana. So this was the private quarters for the women in the Mughal, a Mughal prince's household. And that, I think, is interesting. That is something where they record the dress, they record the habits, they talk, and this is an entree that men would not have had. Other women had this. Rosemary Raza mentions other women also had this entree to the world of women. I should say that Elizabeth and Mary weren't as engaged with the Muslim community as they were with the Hindu community. So their description of the Zanana follows more along those tropes of Orientalism that Anna described. But in terms of the scientific societies, Anna?
Yeah, so women were denied direct participation in most scientific societies in this period, but they would have had access through their networks with East India Company botanists. So, for example, we know that Mary did a painting of Columbo root. Columbo root was a kind of popular medicinal remedy, and it's actually from East Africa. But some of this root had been transplanted to Madras, and Andrew Berry, one of these company surgeons, was growing it in his garden. So Mary did a painting of that, and Berry later published an account in the Asiatic Society's journal. We don't know if the picture that's used was by Mary, because again, there's a reference to a local artist producing a picture as well. But we know that they read those kind of publications. As Victoria mentioned, there was an engagement with William Jones's work, but it would have been at one remove.
Mm-hmm. Also, I mean, Elizabeth was cited twice, I believe twice, maybe three times in Curtis's Botanical magazine. So she was called the patron of science in the presidency, the Madras presidency. So she was known as someone who was interested in natural history at the time. The two drawings that I can recall, though, are not by her in the Sims publication. So, and she was in touch with, through Rottler with Smith. And so when Henry Nolte discovered the drawing of the Gwillimia indica in the Linnean archives, it's in the Smith papers. And so Rottler and Smith were in correspondence. So she was known, Gwillim herself was known as a woman naturalist of that period in those circles.
I think there's a case where women's agency was present in scientific work in this period, but slightly obscured. And the same thing, of course, goes for the Indian experts that Symonds and Gwillim's worked with. We only have first names, as Victoria was mentioning. Their agency is also obscured in the archive that we have remaining.
I should mention as well that one of the projects stemming out of this work was that two of our students did Wikimedia entries, one for Elizabeth Gwillim and one for Mary Symonds, because one of our aims was to bring the work of women to the fore. And so we now, both Mary and Elizabeth now have Wikipedia entries.
Yes, and in fact,
and Henry does too.
A few people, in fact, have asked about Wikipedia, Wikidata. Are you working with Wikimedians to increase the profile of some of these people in places? So that's that.
We would.
Asks,
sorry.
Oh, beg your pardon.
Yeah, I was just going to say also the digital archive is available for the project. It's available on the McGill website. It's the archives website at McGill, through the South Asia Collection Museum, through the Oxford Text Archive. And if you look on the gwillimproject.com website, you'll find links to all of these.
Oh, that's brilliant. Paul, in fact, a few people have asked if the images are publicly available. So.
Yes, they're publicly available and can be used for research.
That's brilliant. I think we've got time for a few more. It's gone past 7 o'clock, but I'm happy to stay on and tackle a few more questions if you are. Caroline asks, wonderful presentation on an inspirational project. Do you think that their observations, textual and visual, are unique in that they were co-created, i.e. they must have discussed these things between themselves and formed their views in tandem?
That's interesting. It's rather like Anne and I doing this dual presentation. We've had a lot of going back and forth over the last few years. It's interesting. I think it was Serafina or Hannah, one of our art history students, looked at, there are a couple of watercolors of scenes that are painted, that are the same seascape. And she looked at them as two sisters painting together. And they're slightly different in viewpoint. So they would paint together. They would sit down in front of a view and paint it. The other thing I think is we can see from their correspondence, they had a warm and affectionate relationship with similar interests. Mm-hmm. So we know that some fish are painted by Elizabeth, some by Mary. They were both there looking at things. I think Elizabeth was much more interested in birds than Mary was, however.
My internet is starting to go choppy, which might be the universe's way of telling us to but I will go for one last question, if only because it slightly anticipated the question that I wanted to ask. So Nicholas asks, in addition to the names of local animals, plants, fish, etc., is there any sense that the women were interested in systems of knowledge, local systems of knowledge, that is? So sort of like an epistemological question there, I guess. Superficial engagement with names or also with taxonomic structures and the way of looking at the world? It's a big
yeah. So you want to talk about Culpeper?
Well, I'll let you talk about Culpeper. Okay. I'll just give the examples I can think of where they were looking for local names, which are clearly the fish. So we have that passage where Elizabeth talks about going down to the seashore and asking fishermen for local names, which kind of mirrors the things that Patrick Russell and other company naturalists would do. And of course, we have those Tamil names in Urdu script, which are on the paintings. And the other thing she says is that the reason she started learning botany was so that she could understand the works she was reading in Telugu. So her study of botany and her study of language were clearly very much intertwined. In other ways, we think that she was somewhat dismissive of non-European systems of classification. So maybe that's where Culpeper comes
so she, in one of her letters, she writes about, and John Lurdiswamy has pointed this out from IIT Madras as well. She writes about how, well, you know, they know about plants and they know that she's talking about remedies. They know about remedies, but it's kind of like Culpeper, you know, and she says, you know, Culpeper's in the past. It's, you know, the influence of the stars, the influence, you know, the hot, cold, the four tempers. And she says, you know, that's in the past. She implies her understanding is more scientific, more reasoned. And so is quite dismissive. She says their remedies work, but they really have no theory. So she's dismissing the theory of medicine, though she says the remedies do work. And just one last thing in terms of naming, on the back of the India, because you have it there, the India Gwillimia indica, she's written, Henry Nolte thinks she has written in Tamil, in Telugu, the name of the plant in Malaysian, because it's a series of syllables, and I can't quite do it now. Sampaka, which isn't a word, but it is how it was called in Malaysian, and so she's written that in Telugu on the back of the plant. So it's not just, it was at first assumed it wasn't a word, but it was actually her transcription of the original name of the plant.
In fact, we have one last question, so we'll tick that off. Mary asks, is astronomy or astronomical occurrences mentioned in their diaries or their correspondence?
Not
Weather.
really. I mean, there's a lot on weather, and this is the period when the Madras Observatory was started as well. But unfortunately, I can't think of anything much.
No, they
about
talk a lot
astronomy.
about monsoon. The effects of weather on health is very big. The wind, the effects of the wind. There's a lot of, they have a lot of, just in going through all the letters, there must be, I extracted all of the mentions. There's 6 pages of their comments on weather, wind, rain, the heat. So a great deal of interest in, because environment and health, they're thinking of, you know, climate and health as being linked, and they wonder if they'll ever season themselves to the climate of Madras.
It's good to know the English obsession with the weather is
yes, it continues.
degree, 200.
They actually compare the weather in India to the weather in England. So it's just like your rainy season there, just warmer.
Well, on that note, I think we will wrap up. But thank you so much, Anna and Victoria. That was a real treat for a drizzly Tuesday afternoon. Any other questions, please do go and read the book. We have a copy in the Linsop Library, and a very fine piece of work it is too. So thank you so much.